Hey Dunchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it is time for my review of the sophomore album from Alon Mor. This one is called Long Awaited Journey. Now, I'm pretty sure that's pronounced Alon Mor, although I don't know 100%. It could be Alon Mor. There's not really any auditory interviews of him online saying his own name, so I can't really know for sure, and all Google Translate is giving me is roughly a lawnmower.
Alon Mor. Alon Mor. Alon Mor.
Anyway, Alon Mor is an Israeli producer and composer who doesn't really have any big claims to fame. In fact, really his most widely known work on any platform, including YouTube, SoundCloud, and Spotify, is his song Presudeos from this album. The song's got 100,000 plays, which, don't get me wrong, that's absolutely nothing to scoff at. I couldn't personally hit that as an EDM artist right now. I definitely couldn't. But it's not like thousands, if not tens of thousands of EDM artists haven't already hit this milestone. I'd probably say that the biggest attention Alon Mor has gotten so far is through the highly respectable dubstep promotion channel The Dub Rebellion, who's uploaded a number of tracks by him. Although I personally didn't take notice of him until my 3,000 subscriber live stream, in which one or more of you suggested that I go check out his music, and I remembered when I did, it was a pretty magical experience. Alon Mor's distinct blend of orchestral and electronic music is extremely fresh, even if the idea behind it isn't totally new. I mean, I've reviewed artists like Varian, Mako, and Crywolf in the past who all kind of use those same elements. And maybe it was this distinct production style that initially caught my attention. Or maybe it's just the fact that Alon Mor's fans are so incredibly dedicated. His fans, most notably my thumbnail editor Patrick, shout out Patrick, consistently requested that I reviewed this album before it even dropped. And yeah, I was planning on touching on the album in one way or another, whether it was in a full review or a rapid fire review, depending on how the album turned out. But then about a week ago, Alon actually personally emailed me about reviewing his album, which was a huge honor. It takes a lot of humility to ask for criticism, especially when it's a critic like myself who's not so easily impressed. I mean, I've only given 2 9s this year and nothing higher than that, and I've never given a 10 to an album before. So I obliged and said, of course I'll review the album. Little did I know how challenging doing a video like this was going to be. This album is over an hour long, and it's got a ton to dig into. I could spend probably hours going into every little detail that I liked about this album, but I really don't think that's going to be beneficial to you or me, so I'm going to be speaking very generally about this album for the most part. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say it plainly, Long Awaited Journey is a great album for all intents and purposes. Although longtime fans of Mor definitely shouldn't go into this album expecting some big, grand change in style from his debut album, Masters of the Human Imagination. Just like Masters of the Human Imagination, Long Awaited Journey is largely a cinematic album that uses a lot of electronic music elements in it. Although I would say that I do generally like the taste of the blend of those genres a little bit better on this album than his debut. While on Masters of the Human Imagination, it seemed like Alon Mor was more or less using these epic orchestral intros to build tension for the more experimental, hard-hitting drops that appear numerous times on the album. While on the other hand, it seems like Long Awaited Journey is much more of a cinematic album that really only uses its drops sparingly to kind of create a particular atmosphere. And even if I do see some similarities between tracks on Masters of the Human Imagination and Long Awaited Journey, for example, the song Graphic Rain on that album is definitely comparable to songs like Presudeos and the Midlar from this album, I do generally think this album is an improvement for Alon Mor. Another big part of this I feel like is definitely Alon Mor's sound design, which is absolutely incredible. Just about each and every vibration on this album feels intentional. At least my first time listening through this album, I was wearing my headphones and I'd hear these little tiny details sitting way back in the mix, and I'm thinking like, how on earth did he even think to put these details in the music? My thought is that Alon Mor's philosophy on music goes way past just the composition and more or less into actually taking listeners into a specific atmosphere that he comes up with in his mind. Because of that, I don't think Long Awaited Journey is the kind of album you want to listen to with like a group of friends or cruising down the highway or anything like that. If you want to listen to this album, in my opinion, the best way to do it is kind of just kick back, lay down, if you have to blindfold yourself, or listen to this album at night, so it's dark. You can kind of just close your eyes and completely immerse yourself in Alon Mor's world. Now, when it comes to a very cinematic album like Long Awaited Journey, the big question is always going to be, how does the album push across its story? For example, on the album Everything, Leto conveys his story using a variety of different vocalists, including himself, who kind of give different pieces of the story and different emotions that he was experiencing throughout it. Ferry Corsten's Blueprint, which dropped earlier this year, paints a very clear picture for listeners using almost strictly dialogue and narration. This album, though, on the other hand, having almost no dialogue or lyrics, has a very hard time of trying to convey whatever it's trying to convey. Because of its lack of storytelling except musically through the majority of this album, I feel like Long Awaited Journey did hit a little bit shy of its potential. This could have been improved with a bit more dialogue in the first half of the album, maybe a little bit of lyricism as well, or preferably a visual element. In my humble opinion, I think this album is good enough to the point where it should have some kind of film or visual element to accompany it, and not necessarily on the big screen, although I'd absolutely love to see that, and I'd love to see Alon Mor kind of transition into just being a film composer, because he's definitely got the talent to do so. But just some kind of visual that would cue listeners into why there are so many like drastic changes in style within the songs themselves. And don't get me wrong, there is a kind of plot going on throughout this album, although the large majority of it falls in the second half, with Alon kind of having this soliloquy about a coin and a bridge on the track Tyche singing. And I might just be stupid, but I don't really fully understand this story and this plot a ton as of now. And I think if Alon Mor would have better set the stage with that plot toward the beginning of the album, then it would have made a lot more sense to me in the end, but because it falls so heavily at the end, it's like, it feels like a totally different project almost. On the other hand, the subplot definitely does showcase some degree of improvement over Masters of the Human Imagination, an album that definitely felt a lot more like a compilation because the tracks really had nothing to do with each other and they really didn't tie in. At least this album, it does it on part of it. Another thing that I did want to mention though is that Alon Mor might be kind of shying away from your general story arc, which starts with your exposition, has its rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution, which is definitely kind of the same arc that an album like Everything by Leto had. On the other hand, this album feels a little bit more like a collection of short stories, something akin to The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, because each of these songs seem to have their own little individual arcs rather than having the entirety of the album have this big story arc to it. And I'd say that that theory is evidenced by the fact that one of the most intense tracks on the entire album, Halpfire Harmonies, comes at the very smack dab end of the album instead of somewhere in the middle or toward the end when the climax should be happening, rather than right at the end. And just to reinstate, I wouldn't personally like to go in and change anything about this record. In fact, if I touched it, I'd probably ruin it. But I would like to see some spots, like I said, toward the beginning of the album where Alon Mor explains a little bit better in terms of dialogue, kind of what's going on to set the stage a little bit better. Other than that, I really think this album is pretty fantastic, and I definitely would call myself a new fan. In terms of skill in sound design and composition, this album is definitely a 10, but since that's not the only thing I rate based on, I'm probably feeling a strong 9 out of 10, which is still very, very good, and I would definitely suggest you guys check out this album if you haven't already. I'm assuming most of the people tuning in to this review are going to be big fans of Alon Mor previously, so let me know what you think down in the comment section below, and if you do want to check it out if you haven't yet, which I would highly suggest you do, I have the Spotify link down in the description. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this review. I hope this review wasn't too disappointing for you, Mr. Mor. Anyway, I'll catch you guys later. Peace.